First of all, one of my neuroticisms is that I hate introducing people. I really like it if people introduce themselves. So as far as I know now, you are a resident of China, but we can find you in other places than China. This is something that perhaps you can briefly introduce. You have worked with Vietnam a lot. You are in Ho Chi Minh City right now, if I'm correct.
Correct.
And you deal both with helping the hard aspect of businesses and the soft skills that we are definitely going to discuss here. So please fill in the rest of your profile and then hand it over to me so that I can talk a little bit more about the topic today.
Thank you, Gabor. Let me start with a compliment. So I have been stalking Gabor basically on LinkedIn for quite a while, because I think that Gabor is basically, I think, one of the few guys who really understands China and Asia very well. Having a diplomatic background and having worked and lived there a long time, there's a lot of, talk about Asia, China, Vietnam, but there's not many people who have really substance. So that's why I followed you, Gabor, and you already explained how we got in touch. You're right, I'm in Asia since 2003, and born in the Netherlands, raised in Austria. I actually am not a technical guy from the beginning. I studied music in Salzburg, in beautiful Austria, but ended up in Hong Kong for very technological reasons in public transport. Today, I do not want to talk too much about technology, but really about the fascinating developments that we now see, particularly in China, but also in Southeast Asia. And due to COVID, I was sort of thrown into a situation where I'm spending part of my time in China. I have been in China for 12 years. I was granted permanent residence there, the famous green card over there, which actually allows me to go back, which is a great thing in these days, without visa. But having seen also Southeast Asia in many roles I had out of China, but also now from inside Vietnam, is very interesting. And I think what we would like to discuss today is really the hard and the soft side, as you say, Gabor, of doing business out of China with Southeast Asia. And I think it's a fascinating topic because until now I hear a lot of webinars that are pitching, the opportunities in China, in Southeast Asia, or both. But I think we would succeed today if we have a more rounded picture from inside out, how it works from the economical perspective, but also from the people and the political perspective. And I think there's people on the call who can help you with that. So I hope it will be a very interesting conversation.
Yes, so let's pick up from there. We have been in touch about China+1 for a while, mostly on LinkedIn. And that is a fascinating topic to me. So let me just quickly introduce what we mean by China+1 and why that is interesting, and specifically why that is interesting to Jurriaan and myself, who are helping companies with these transitions firsthand. So first of all, I can share a couple of links to articles here during the call about what China+1 is, but actually a simple Google search will guide you to places like Wikipedia and a couple of business publications that define it. It originally came from Japanese companies, which were more exposed to the political risks in China than other companies. But it very quickly got picked up as a simple risk management tool by companies from Europe and eventually the United States as well. So China+1 basically means that there are certain activities in mainland China that are more exposed to certain risks, business-related, politically related, and everything else, than, let's say, other activities. And then the company basically builds an alternative supply chain or an alternative base so that some of these activities can be moved out of China and moved to an alternative location. And at the beginning, when Japanese companies came up with the idea, most of it was that some activities can be, in a very, very agile manner, be brought back to Japan almost instantly in case something is going wrong with the business relations and political relations of China and Japan. But then specifically German companies figured out that there are other risks that can be managed with the China+1 strategy. Some of it were very purely business ones. For example, the rising labor cost in the People's Republic of China. Regulations that were unfriendly to polluting industry, and so forth. The only big difference in this case was that obviously, let's say if a German or a Dutch company was thinking about China+1, then the motherland, so to speak, was not in such a convenient vicinity as Japan was. So these companies had to look at another location that could serve as China+1. And that's when Southeast Asia comes into the picture, and that's where Jurriaan will have a lot to say about this, because as far as I know, almost all of the China+1 strategic countries, maybe in some industries except for Bangladesh, are in Southeast Asia. So many companies build these kind of alternative presences, if grammatically that is possible, in Southeast Asian countries to mitigate the risks, both political and business, of China. Now, where it becomes, the whole thing where it becomes extremely interesting is when it gets confused with companies leaving China. So China+1 doesn't mean that companies are pulling out of China. Actually, the companies that build a solid China+1 strategy are very often the most committed to the mainland Chinese market. But they want to make sure that certain elements that are not viable in China for many reasons already, they can be moved somewhere else. And the last thing that I will mention before I give the floor back to you is that I just recently read an article about how Chinese companies are making use of China+1 strategies, which is both the beauty and the irony of how know-how in business spreads from one community to another. And it's perfectly understandable, because if you think about it, both the political and the business risks, so let's say both the tariffs and the punitive measures that Beijing imposes, let's say, on South Korean companies or American companies, and the risks like rising labor costs or punishing polluting industries in China, they squeeze Chinese businesses just as much as international businesses. So what happens, and I'm working on a book in which I'm actually today, I have just published an article, it came out a couple of minutes ago on Asia Power Watch, where I mentioned that sometimes the supply chains that get dismantled in mainland China, they get rebuilt exactly the same way somewhere else. Meaning, let's say, the same German and the same Chinese company cooperate, let's say, in Indonesia.
Yes.
This is where I would like to hand the floor back to you. And please, we can do a very free flow of ideas. And every half an hour or so, we will stop and we will ask all the participants whether they have questions or thoughts to us.
Excellent. So thank you, Gabor. You are putting some soccer balls in front of the goal, because I think there's a lot of points we can comment on. So firstly, it was indeed the Japanese who did it first, then followed the Koreans. But you're absolutely right. The third group that came in was the Chinese themselves. So last year, I helped a big Chinese producer of personal protective equipment to move from China to Vietnam. And it basically helps me also to debunk a couple of myths. Because you mentioned, why would we move to Southeast Asia? Not particularly Vietnam. It could be Malaysia, Indonesia, the whole region. So let's take it one by one. Labor cost. Labor cost in Southeast Asia is not substantially lower than certain areas in China. China is still working very hard to explore the Western and Middle regions. And the actual, if you take efficiency and productivity into account, I think China still is very competitive, even on that one. The second one is the supply chain. You will be surprised if you see companies moving to Southeast Asia, how dependent they are on supplies from China. So I think we have reached a point in, let's say, the global supply chain that China is sort of a huge rock in the middle that cannot be circumvented. I mean, on a global scale, there is now a big debate on rare earth and on other stuff that is really coming from China. But even on the lower value supply chain, like making something like a face mask or hand sanitizer, here in Vietnam, 80% of the raw materials are still coming from China. And then there is a development, also talking in terms of cost. As many of you might have heard, the costs of the supply chain logistics has gone up tremendously under the COVID pressure. So a container, not only from China, but also from Vietnam now is 5, 6, 7 times more expensive. So the whole business case Gabor just mentioned to move to Vietnam has become a very contentious one. And what I would like to discuss with the audience today is actually this. The one-on-one, let's say, transplantation of low-value manufacturing from China to, say, Vietnam, Malaysia, or Indonesia, I think is a very short-lived investment that will not earn its money back. Number one, because the supply chain still is very much dependent from China, and you have these customs issues that you need to tackle. You still have the taxes. And number two, I think that the longer trend is that everything will be eventually deglobalized to a certain extent. Let's call it near sourcing. So Europe will focus on Eastern Europe, Bulgaria, Romania. They have fantastic workforces that are actually returning from places like the UK after Brexit. These people are highly educated and they don't make much more than people in China, or even less. That is a very big, consideration. And eventually, if you look at America, to come back to my case, we just saw the step moving from China to close to Ho Chi Minh as an intermediate step, because eventually everything that is serving the American market will move closer to America, like Mexico, into what they call dark factories, where there's no light because there's machines doing everything that humans did before. So I think the challenge I see for Southeast Asia is not fall into the trap to become a copycat of China that was 20 years ago, but really find the sweet spot under these new circumstances that were triggered by COVID. Mm-hmm. So I will give a further explanation on that one, but I think that is my first statement I would like to make on China+1.
Right. There are a couple of very interesting thoughts there. I just have to say this. There is this soundbite, slowbalization.
Yes.
Which is the slowing of globalization, but I think I agree with you that now we are seeing the reversal, not just the slowing of this. And obviously, there are two trends going on here, and it's quite fascinating to me. So all my friends who were participants of China+1, one of the things that happens is that these leaders start spending more time outside of China and more in places like Southeast Asia, or in some cases Bangladesh, Pakistan, and so on. And one of the things that many of them told me is that it's a little bit, especially veterans like us. I mean, you have been in China or Asia since 2003. I've been in China since 2002. So my friends who come back from these strategic visits, spending a month or two in Indonesia or Philippines and so on, so they come back and they say, you know, it's a little bit like China in the good old days when I arrived. In terms of infrastructure, in the prep call, we mentioned corruption as an issue. In terms of how local people look at foreigners, how they work with foreigners, it's a bit of a time travel. But of course, this is the classic time travel dilemma, that the time travel never takes place in a time vacuum. And what you mentioned is automation, robots, dark factories, and so on. So the past and the future, they kind of mishmash together in a strange concoction of modernity, automation, digitization, the apps that we use both for work and for keeping in touch with people on a daily basis. But on the other hand, if you step out in the streets or if you go to a meeting, it could happen that you are operating in a much less compliant, much more flexibly regulated environment. So this is, again, it's not a real question. It is, again, one of the soccer balls in front of the goal to see which way you are taking it.
Absolutely, and I think for my Chinese clients who wanted to set up that factory here in Vietnam, it was a disappointment to see that the environmental rules were exactly the same as in China. They were strict, and they should be so. There was a healthy, wariness of not only Chinese, but any company coming in that is polluting. They wanted to have investment that is sustainable. I think, you're absolutely right. So this is not Groundhog Day or just, a simple springboard to repeat what you have done 20 years before in China. So to continue a little bit on my reasoning, I think for Southeast Asia, there's a big opportunity here. Provided we still acknowledge that China is here to stay. So China will be there making fantastic spare parts, high quality technology, doing the R&D, delivering it to Southeast Asia. And Southeast Asia can still play a role as a hub for assembly, making, garment, furniture, but it has to be close to the raw materials, ideally close to raw materials from their own country. So if you take Vietnam, I would say focus on the lower end on very much the produce that they have in your own country, like coffee, fantastic agricultural products that are now actually being helped by Dutch companies to bring it to a higher quality level. So less volume, but higher quality, because that sells better in terms of margins. So we need to help Southeast Asia to find their niche on the existing market, but also move up the value chain. And here comes Ho Chi Minh in. Ho Chi Minh, I think, has gold in their hands, because what I see here is an enormous amount of people who are not in the hard stuff. They are in IT. So there is a lot of predominantly French companies who are already doing this sort of under the radar for years, which is IT offshoring or software as a service. Right. You meet Vietnamese who are fluent in Norwegian, and they're doing the customer service of a parking lot in the middle of Oslo. This is a little bit the Filipino model, but it's a little bit more value. So here they not only provide the service, but also the IT solutions behind it. And that is an example, I think, where Southeast Asia should focus on. And of course, the manufacturing that is more on the high level. So of course, we want to have the Foxconns, and we want to have the Samsungs, who want to have an alternative location for China. That is obvious. But in between, there is a big gray area. And governments like the Vietnamese one, they are not interested in the low-end polluting, people unfriendly behavior. So this was also a big challenge for my Chinese managers, who actually had the plan to bring in 10 Chinese managers, 0 Vietnamese, so all management layers in that Vietnamese factory would then basically be Chinese. And I told them this is not going to work, because you want to get the permit, because it would be seen as a Chinese invasion. So there's a lot to learn. And I think I don't hear these conclusions in these analyses. So I'd like to be challenged on this one very much, if my observation is correct.
Yeah, I will give a long introduction to my next question, because we can look at this call from many different angles. And as far as I can see, many of the colleagues who are joining us today are from Asia, actually, or in Asia. But let's look at it from the West. And I always imagine this in terms of geometry. So basically, if you look at Europe from China, then Greece or Austria is just a couple of degrees of difference, and it's very difficult to see the gap between the cultures, the technological readiness, and so on. It's a little bit the same with China and Southeast Asia if you look at it from the perspective of Amsterdam or Milan. So you mentioned China, you mentioned Vietnam, you mentioned the Philippines. And when it comes to the readiness for international business, there is a huge variety here. I started off by mainly providing language services back in my country while I was still a university student. And one of the things was I taught Asian business people English in Budapest. And there was a Vietnamese community who, by the time they learned English in Hungary, they were absolutely fluent in Hungarian because they studied there. And in Vietnam, people studied all over the place. Some of them, as you mentioned not Norwegian or Danish, I can't remember. But some of them Eastern European languages, because Eastern European countries were friendly countries. They were also communist countries. So I remember I had this student called Nguyen, a very common Vietnamese name, and there were some Hungarian people in the group. And when we wanted to translate something from English to Hungarian, and the Hungarian struggled a little bit, then I always turned to him and say, Nguyen, could you please? And he translated everything to impeccable Hungarian. Interestingly, the Philippines is also a traveling nation. Famously, about 10% of the Filipino population lives and studies outside of the country. But they typically don't return from, let's say, European countries or Middle Eastern countries with fluent language knowledge. So in Vietnam, I see something like the mixture of the Southeast Asian mobility and the commitment of the Confucian attitude to learning. What I would like to ask you about this is, let's imagine that I run a German or a French or a British company in China, and I want to build a China+1 strategy. And actually, as far as I saw, like, let's say, at least half of the China+1 companies, I consider Vietnam as a prime location. Could you please tell us a couple of things, a couple of factors in which you think Vietnam is ready to receive this China+1 investment, and a couple of fields where it is not ready? So it can be because of the local Vietnamese circumstances, developed versus undeveloped, or simply because Vietnam is more specialized in some areas and less specialized in others.
Yeah, it's a very interesting question. We can also dive into the different psychological structures of the different, mostly young people that would work in such a company. I think it's common knowledge that Southeast Asia obviously does have still some work to do on things like infrastructure. I think also transparency, you mentioned that. Again, don't get me wrong, I'm still enormously admiring China for its infrastructure, the rail system, but also the infrastructure in terms of setting up a factory. Nowadays, everything can be done online. In China, corruption, at least in setting up a company, is back to zero for very well-known reasons. So actually doing business in China is very good, and you get also a lot of support if you do FDI. That here in Vietnam and in Southeast Asia, much more local still. So it's the local government, the local leaders that very much, call the shots. Hanoi, like Beijing, is far away. The emperor is far away, so everybody does as he likes. But I think in that respect, Southeast Asia is really a little bit behind the curve. So it could, turn out to be actually more difficult for this German company to set up shop in Southeast Asia than expected. It's not a cookie cutter kind of thing. You have to be very precise where the location is. You have to look what the location wants. You need to spend time in really building the relationship. So China is really trying to make that uniform. So China really is open for business in the sense that they are trying to reduce the amount of guangxi, of connections. While I think in the whole of Southeast Asia, it's extremely important to have those connections before you even think of coming. On the other hand, what I really like about Southeast Asia and Vietnam in particular is the young workforce. They're extremely inspiring because, as you correctly say, it's really fun because they're eating from two cakes. The one cake is the Confucian, actually very similar to China culture here in Vietnam in particular. Confucian values, honor your parents, honor your boss, listen to what the government does. But at the same time, you see that in the cultural consumption of people, they love to watch Chinese sitcoms. You wouldn't expect that because people think that Vietnam has sort of a negative attitude towards China, but this is also a very layered thing. Chinese sitcoms or Chinese series, especially from historical background, are very famous. Actually, they have introduced new words, like Schweiger is now Saiger. It's a new word here in Vietnam. And they use it. They are ashamed of it, but just learned it yesterday, that they import a lot of work. They love Korean, culture and food, Chinese food. On the other hand, the open internet and the big influence of America in particular through the Viet Kieu, so the people, the kids and the grandchildren of those people that left Vietnam in 1975 after the takeover of the Communist Party. These people bring a lot of values from the West and the West Coast in America in particular, and this is a very interesting amalgam. So you have best of both worlds. People, on the one hand, are extremely individualistic. They all think they are special. They're all looking for meaning in their jobs. At the same time, they're very much aware that they have to sustain a family, that they have to honor those Confucian values. And that is actually perfect because that makes them suitable to work with the Chinese, but also with Western companies. So I think in your particular case, Gabor, I think the onus, the pressure would be, I think, on the German managers, because I think managing a China team would be slightly different than the Vietnamese team. And we can talk about that. And I think the main reason is very simple. In China, your employees are millennials, and here in Vietnam, it's Gen Z.
I see. Excellent. So we will actually pick up on this, because in the second half of the call, I would like to move on to more like the human factors. But what I would like to do, first, one remark, it just reminded me. I was coaching the manager of a German European company who was leading the China branch for a long time. I was her coach, and then when she was moved to Ho Chi Minh City, then I remained her coach remotely. And then one of the interesting things was how she had been in China for over 5 years by then. And then every time she was kind of praising the amazing connectivity in Vietnam. Yeah. It was quite funny because in those days I was spending a lot of time in Europe and in South Korea, where especially South Korea has amazing internet speed. But obviously you wouldn't think of Vietnam as a technological paradise from Shanghai, but you have the tendency to forget that about half of the content on the internet is not available in China, and you suddenly move to Ho Chi Minh City. And I don't know about the speeds, but of course the outrage, the availability of information is completely different. So in this sense, she was really, like, her body language was telling me that it was a huge surprise to her, even though yes, a couple of years in China, and then they can change the perspective that you look at these things. So as I hear you, I will summarize a couple of things. So let's say you're a Western manager, you are scripting your China+1 strategy. I heard a couple of things that could be a pleasant surprise. So one of them is that the dynamism of the workforce, the youth of the workforce, again, we know the demographic issues in China. Also, to me, it was a surprise that you said that there are some Western invested IT or technological companies that are ready to serve international businesses over there. I keep hearing this and I keep forgetting about it. So actually, I heard about the same issue in Thailand, even in Myanmar, because tech companies are very agile. They move very easily. They are very fast to adopt changes. So by the time the larger businesses are there, very often they are already present in those countries. So in this respect, Vietnam would be definitely ready. If you look at the local, more Guangxi-based way of doing business, I think that can be a pro and it can be a con as well. Just like China cleaning up corruption and standardizing everything.
Yes.
At certain times and in certain businesses, that was a blessing, but sometimes it just made it difficult to get things done because a lot of business people were used to anything being possible in China, and suddenly it isn't. So really, I mean, I agree with you that the amount and level of standardization in China is absolutely amazing. I was listening to a podcast earlier today about mergers and acquisitions in China, and how everything is done online now. So there are these compliant, well-regulated online platforms where, let's say, if a Chinese company wants to buy a Western company, you just have to upload the documentation, There is artificial intelligence which checks their genuineness, originality, and most of it can be done. COVID-19 just slowed it down a little bit. I imagine that would be a little bit different in Vietnam and Southeast Asia, and maybe that's why those IT companies are there.
Well, these IT companies are focusing on Western customers. I think Vietnam is now making a big jump in IT, but you have to recognize that people here still have paper-based ID cards. As we speak, they're being exchanged for chip-based ones. You also have to understand, which is a surprise to me, is that very much cash-based. So the WeChat, Alipay kind of mania that we have seen in China is coming here now, again, for Generation Z. So they will catch up. That is all happening. And again, I have to make a big, disclaimer here. I'm talking about the big cities. So this is Hanoi and Ho Chi Minh, and maybe then, and of course, Kuala Lumpur and the big cities in the region. But you have to understand that 60 to 80% still is rural, and there is still a lot of agriculture happening. And these two speeds will happen in parallel, exactly as happened in China, right? And China tries to eradicate that poverty. And personally, I hope that Southeast Asia will do that in a different way, transitioning agriculture to high-end agriculture. And again, the example I gave before, aquaculture, agriculture, with expertise from the Western world that would help that. So I think it's interesting. You're absolutely right. So Southeast Asia, and particularly Vietnam, is sort of a time machine. So you have several realities in parallel, several cultures mixing, and that makes it quite unique. And as some people might know, Vietnam is sort of also flying under the radar. I asked the question to some Vietnamese intellectuals when there's one of the many, many very interesting discussion platforms here in the city. People love that. It's very open. And they said, well, listen, we are not one country yet. We are still three countries, the North, the Middle, and the South, different cultures, different rulers that one by one had to be kicked out. There are still animosities between North and South. So Southeast Asian countries on themselves, not to mention ASEAN, still have to be one. There's also a concern here. I'm reading a lot of articles over the last weeks because of COVID now is turning into a tipping point with the West opening up and Asia lagging behind, is that there is a fear that China will become so dominant culturally but also economically that this will create sort of a disbalance that will take out the air out of the room for Southeast Asia. And I feel that scare with people on the macro and micro level. So on the micro level, young people here tell me their biggest fear is that this country will become like China in terms of the 996. From 9 in the morning, 9 at night, 6 days a week. And that's why I'm fascinated to find a lot of young Koreans here who are learning Vietnamese. Mm-hmm. And why? Because they went to
I will stop you just for 1 second, because before we go into the human aspect. So in the second half of the call, I would like to do two things. Number one, I would like to look more at the leadership and the human aspect of China+1, and also geographically, I would like to widen our scope a little bit. But before that, I would like to talk to everybody and ask you to send your questions in the chat if you have them, or comments, because from now on, I would like to open the forum a little bit. So there are two ways to contribute. One of them is if you type into the chat box to everybody's attention, we will still read out what you wrote, considering that you keep it to a couple of lines. But either if you have a comment or if you have a question, please feel free to type it in. And then the other way to contribute is just type in the box something like "mic, please," and I will give you access. So with this, let's jump back into it, because actually this is a fascinating topic that you mentioned to me last time we were on a preparation call. So there were two things. You mentioned both of them. One of them is that the attitude towards policies like 996 is completely different. And I must say that the Vietnamese and the Southeast Asians, from first-hand experience, I can add, in the Philippines, in Malaysia, Indonesia, people have a similar opinion. they look at China with a certain amount of admiration, but also a little bit of concern. And to be honest with you, this is exactly the kind of attitude that Europeans and Americans had towards Japan for decades. Basically, they told themselves, I understand exactly why it works, how they are creating products like Sony and Toyota with this kind of maniac attitude, but I really don't wish this culture of work would come to my place. So I think people in many countries over the world are more with the Vietnamese on this. And then you mentioned that some Korean young people, they come to Vietnam. Of course, if you have ever been there, you know, I'm not talking to you, Jurriaan, but everybody else, then you know what the food is like, what the nature is like, what the people are like. And when you said that a lot of young Koreans, they go there to take it a little bit easier and enjoy life more, but still reap the rewards of smart work, I immediately remembered this book called The Burnout Society, which was written by a Korean psychologist, interestingly, not Japanese or Chinese, but it was very much about pushing us over the limit and basically creating a culture of diminishing returns. So again, from behind the desk or from the shoes of a Chinese or Western or American or Japanese or whatever manager that is scripting China+1 strategy, what do I need to expect to have to do differently when I work with Vietnamese people? I will bring in my own stories, but you knowing both societies so well, where would you start? What is it that, if I have been working in China for 5 years and now I have to manage people in Vietnam, is not going to work?
Well, first the practical things. Let's step into the time machine again. I think you will face what you faced 10 years ago in China, which is, number one, a horrible rate of attrition. One of my friends is online and he had an employee joining him for 1 day and then he left. So you have a turnover of staff up to 20%. So that is tough, and that is just how it is, because it is very difficult, you know, in a society where everyone counts to keep that going. So I think this is universal. Whether you are in China or in Vietnam, you have to come up with good career paths and with, you know, the learning opportunity. That is universal all over Asia, in China and in Vietnam. And I think particularly in Southeast Asia, the youngest, they are very eager to learn. So I'm mentor for the Royal Melbourne Institute of Technology. They have campuses in Singapore, but also in Ho Chi Minh, and they're doing online. And always the same story comes back to me. People are 20 years old or even younger, and they're already very afraid to make a choice. They feel they have to be pushed into a choice for a certain company, but we are all looking for is a learning environment where they can grow. So I think that is very recognizable, I guess, for everybody. 10 years ago in China, it was the same. In China, I think now it has more consolidated. And the second thing is, as we discussed before, you have to find a very good agent or support on the ground, particularly in Southeast Asia. Processes are there, but they are not followed. So you need to have the informal channels to really set up your company and find the connections and really check your business case. I think that is from the business setup side, you need to really take your time. So it will not be fast. You want to take your time, speak to your own countrymen who can introduce you to a good agent or to a chamber of commerce or somebody who can help you. So it's a little bit, you know, it's a little bit swampy. You have to really be more adventurous. Mm-hmm. So if you are used to the very regimented and very orderly, I would almost say German or Korean-like, you know, processes in China, you have to step back and go back in your khaki suit and really, step back in time. It's really like, you know, a little bit the Deng Xiaoping area, which I didn't experience, but maybe the early 2000s when we arrived.
Speaking of that, how about language? So if you look at China+1 countries, you really don't have to worry about communicating in English, let's say in the Philippines or Malaysia. And then there are all those countries like Indonesia, Bangladesh, and so on, which are somewhere in the middle, where people have a strong English education at school, but that would, again, I think, be closer to China today. And then there are those countries in Southeast Asia like Thailand, and I'm asking you about Vietnam now, when you really shouldn't expect to, let's say, run a business entirely in English. There would be the need to either surround yourself with people who are functional in the local language, or just learn the local language yourself if you're that kind of person. So what is the situation on the ground? And obviously I'm asking about the places where the typical international company would go.
Yeah, so I think that is again the time machine, and I'm not happy with this one. So if you speak to the average expat here, nobody takes the effort to learn Vietnamese, which is understandable. You know, number one, it's not a language that's very handy outside the country. It's difficult to learn as well. But there is always the answer, there is no need. And personally, I do not agree. Gabor, you and I have learned Mandarin to a very high level. My role in China, when I work with my team in China, it's entirely in Mandarin. When I speak to my customers, it's in Mandarin. When I speak to the government, it's also in Mandarin, because one thing I really do not like is to have to work through translators or some assistant who might get my point wrong, and I cannot build a relationship with my counterparts. And I think eventually that will come in Vietnam sooner or later. So the expats are sort of in the comfort zone that they can speak English or maybe a little bit French. From the employee point of view, I think the English level, it's not that easy. There is good English speakers, but it's not like the Philippines. It's not like Thailand. So yeah, it depends on what industry you're in, but I do expect, with even Vietnam becoming more critical to foreigners. So you know that Vietnam had a sort of a backpacker kind of a, you know, remote worker kind of paradise reputation that is ending. So they're following actually China in that sense by cleaning up their act. So I think I would really welcome with local expats in Southeast Asia, like Indonesia. They had a scare that everybody had to learn Bahasa, right? So Indonesian. For a couple of months, they retracted that. But you see also here, the government really, they want to have the quality people from abroad and not the bullies, you know, coming from China or from everywhere. So I think that's a good development.
Yes. So what I would like to do is I would like to elaborate on something you said, and then we are going through a couple of questions, because people, I think, notified us that they would like to ask something through the microphone. What I would like to elaborate on is your half sentence about an assistant or somebody who is next to you. You can call it an interpreter, you can call it a minder. Much of my initial experience with an intercultural environment came from my early days in the UN and the OSCE, which is a European security organization. And I mainly worked in the former Yugoslavia, which is an interesting case study, since extremely diverse in terms of all the factors that actually later I will share with you, Duknian mentioned in her comment, from economy to history to religion to social structure to culture to whatever you can imagine. And in environments like this, it's extremely easy to slip and make some stupid mistake. And it's even easier not to notice that it happened. So there are two things that I can definitely recommend as a follow-up to something that you said. Number one, get a trusted person. Also, don't cheap out. Find somebody who speaks your language very well, who preferably has experience working with your parts of the world. Take them to meetings and then create this code language, you know, like the baseball players with the, when you are going in a direction where you're not supposed to go, so that they can stop you without making you losing face, especially in a culture like East and Southeast Asia, because it's extremely easy to step on taboos, disrespect, all kinds of traditions, cross man to woman, age group lines, and so on. And it's all putting it into the context of China+1. I'm not talking about China. I'm talking about the typical first and second tier cities in China, where most of the overwhelming majority of foreigners live. It is a flexible, fairly straightforward environment, not a Confucian-based environment. Places like Beijing, Guangzhou, Shanghai, and so on. And also, it's, how do you say, it's a little bit of an amnesiac environment when it comes to traditional values like religion or history. So interestingly, a lot of foreigners who work in China, they begin not to worry about these things, not to worry about history, not to worry about religion, not to worry about respecting the elders, because they work in this extremely dynamic and straightforward environment. Then they go to to a place like Indonesia or Bangladesh or Vietnam, and suddenly the age groups, the social hierarchy, the tradition, the religion, they all come back and they really can hit them like a barn door.
Yes, absolutely. Well, I think that connects to a question that we got, or a remark from Mr. Nguyen, that is what you're referring to. I think it would suit the expat of the next generation. So I would almost talk about, Gabor, about a post-pandemic expatriate. We all know that expatriates are going home in droves for multiple reasons, not only from China, but also from Southeast Asia, because it's tough, We can go back, but we cannot return. We have quarantines, 3, 4, 5 weeks. It's not easy. So I think the post-pandemic expatriate hopefully is somebody who takes the effort to learn a little bit of a language, maybe code language, but also understand the history of the country. Very complex history in China, but also in Vietnam, and particularly also relation to China. So to avoid stepping on toes or other, edgy things, you're totally right. You need to take your time, and I think that is fundamentally different to a type that you always very funnily describe, Gabor, the typical engineer that is sent from the German, manufacturing headquarters, making some, cars or machinery. That is the expert. And I still see that a little bit here in Vietnam, but I think that has changed. I think now it's more people who really have to establish the relationships, and that's a good thing.
Right. Let me read out. So I think Duknian's comment, we refer to it, and then Joseph Weir has a question. Do you see brands or companies from Vietnam or any other Southeast Asian country going out to other parts of the world like Chinese companies have done in Africa and elsewhere? I personally do. So I have worked with companies from Philippines, from Thailand and Vietnam. In China, maybe it's just me, but the ones that I run into most often are food service companies. Companies with canned food, fish, frozen goods, and also companies that sell the technology of food processing, because most of these Southeast Asian countries are quite well known. I also see the occasional IT or technology company, because Southeast Asian countries like Indonesia and Malaysia, they are also coming up with very innovative IT solutions. And sometimes Chinese companies like gaming companies or data companies, they are interested in buying know-how from Southeast Asia, if for no other reason, is for partnership reasons. So that companies like Alibaba and Tencent, they can extend their services towards those countries, which is a quite hopeful thing. So that is, and obviously, if you look at not just Southeast Asia, but generally the countries with a lower, let's say, at an earlier stage of development than China, including places like Pakistan, Bangladesh, but also including places like Indonesia and Thailand. And for example, what's been happening in the textile industry is that international and Chinese companies, they moved some of their manufacturing into these countries. Then they found a market there. Then they created research and development, design, and so on there. And now some of those companies, they are moving back to China. And there are quite interesting things in clothing, for example. There is some know-how that China doesn't have yet. So these local suppliers of Chinese companies, they set up shop in China, and then they start partnerships there. These are the examples that come to my mind, but maybe you have better ones.
No, I think there's sort of, again, it depends on where you are in the value chain. So the examples you gave, I think, are absolutely right. I think sooner or later, Africa will be the booming place for global, for manufacturing of many, many goods. So that is a threat for Southeast Asia. It's pretty clear. and also Asia as a whole. But as you say, I think there will be more automation. There will be less reliance on logistics, so there will be near sourcing. So I think it is sort of a tailor-made kind of a new supply chain model will arise. But eventually, it's all about going a race to the bottom. But I'm optimistic. It's not only about price anymore. I think consumers will step back from the ultra cheap. I think those ages are behind us. I hope so. Well, I think it's also interesting to have the question of Alexandre. The question is,
exactly.
Due to the trade between the US and China, do you see Korean, Japanese, and Taiwanese companies move their production facilities to Vietnam? Well, the answer is yes. That's happening. That's happening full swing for years.
Let me show one of your slides to answer this question. What I would like to show you is this network of trade agreements, because obviously what is happening is politicians come up with the trade wars, and then business people try to catch up with the solutions to the trade wars. And just like it happened in previous trade wars between, let's say, just look at what has been happening between the United States and Iran for many decades now, is we are going to see companies build up these channels of moving from one free trade area to the other one. So Vietnam has one with the EU, and China has one with Vietnam. And I'm absolutely sure that companies are going to be able to use ASEAN, China, Japan, Korea, Europe, and the United States. And there are going to be these kind of overlapping patches of free trade zones. So it's going to be a very interesting side effect of the kind of globalization, the kind of deglobalization that Jurriaan already mentioned. But you sent me the slide, so I'm sure that you have some interesting comments about them.
Well, I think everybody who works in Southeast Asia looks at this picture, and I think Vietnam is number one, being basically everywhere. That is the gist of this picture. But I agree, it's also a little bit atomizing. So there has been a lot of talk, particularly about this EU free trade agreement that was signed last year. But we also here have to be very realistic. The execution of those treaties is the proof, is the eating of the pudding. So on paper, it looks all good, within 5 to 10 years, all the trade barriers in both directions have to go, but they don't fall. Governments change their mind, and the day-to-day, the value now for European or Western companies is not that easily gained, but it's a good beginning. But I think this picture also reflects, the very, how to say, the disparity of ASEAN. They love each other, but they also hate each other. Everybody is looking for the best bargain. Mm-hmm. And that's more a political observation. I think ASEAN really needs to work on a model that is a little bit more integrated, but it's very difficult. That's more a political thing, and we are not going to change that in a long time. So I think despite this picture, which looks very promising, what is not shown clearly in the picture is we should actually have China, the flag of China, 10 times as big, because it throws a big shadow over this. So regardless all these treaties, China is in the middle of everything. China, just look at a couple of countries, for Vietnam, China is the biggest trading partner and is becoming bigger and bigger every year. New Zealand and Australia, New Zealand 30%, Australia similar. So what is really the discomfort is that China has sort of under the radar evolved to such an important part of the supply chain, but also in the trade relations as a customer, that those attempts to marginalize China and all these things, I think that is a completely wrong approach. Yes. But that is more China thing. So it looks nice on paper, but the execution is there, and that is really the challenge for people on the ground, like we have on the call.
And in the meantime, yes, just a quick thought. What I am reading these days is very often companies move partially away from China to actually avoid US taxes that are imposed on these global supply chains due to the US-China trade war. So basically, just because something was made in China, now it qualifies for certain very harsh taxes by the United States. So basically, obviously, politicians can never be as clever as all the corporate lawyers combined. So quite cleverly, what companies do is that they move the most sensitive part of their operations. Sometimes it's manufacturing, sometimes it's research and development, sometimes it's assembly, sometimes something else. They simply move it to another location which is not under the same US taxes or customs. That could be Taiwan, Korea, Japan, although Japan is usually not one of the most popular options, but South Korea is, and all over Southeast Asia, Vietnam and Indonesia being some of the darlings of this China+1 strategy. ASEAN was my original research topic in the 90s. That's what got me started on Europe-Asia relations. And I perfectly agree with you. I mean, Westerners, they are always a little bit hopeful or naive in these kind of things. So when ASEAN started and they started integrating, and specifically when they started integrating countries like Cambodia, then there was a lot of hope that it would be something like the European Union in East Asia. But that's simply because sitting in Brussels or in London, you just simply cannot imagine the level of diversity that you have. Also, if you look at Southeast Asia or East Asia even, and Europe, I mean, we have laughable distances in Europe, basically places that sound very, very far from each other. Let's say like Milan or Cologne. You can just get in the car and you can drive from one place to another. So obviously it went in a different direction, but it's interesting now that very recently the ASEAN has brokered, I think, the biggest free trade agreement in the history of free trade agreements. And I think its importance is going to grow now that this kind of segmentation is going to disrupt some of those supply chains that were built around China. But I perfectly agree with you. This by no means undermines the importance of China. It's most like it's going to build up around China, because the alternative locations like Indonesia, Vietnam, Thailand, Bangladesh, and so on, they don't have the infrastructure. They don't have the transparency. Interestingly, China has moved up very, very quickly in recent years in those terms. So it is genuinely going to be China+1. So let's move on to Hedda. Do you know of Vietnamese companies that take advantage of the situation in China and promote themselves in Europe as the alternative of China as a production location? If so, which sections? So please, storytelling time.
Very good. Well, Hedda is a good friend of mine, and I think she has a very smart question. And I would say not enough. So one of the things that really surprises me about Vietnam from the top level is the marketing of Vietnam. So just a question to everybody, but if you drop the name Vietnam, everybody is still thinking of the Vietnam War, or maybe a nice destination for vacation. But there is really a big need to rebrand or to market Vietnam more aggressively. I think the country has all reason to be very proud for several reasons. Fantastic products, but who would know that Vietnam has a fantastic coffee culture, that there is #2 producer of coffee. So this has to do, I think that Vietnam still is very busy with itself. And I think there is nothing compared to China or other countries like Thailand or Taiwan or Japan in terms of branding. So I think on a company-to-company level, it's a little bit similar. I always say in China, you have Alibaba, right? So you have this fantastic platform with all its limitations, but it was really a game changer because suddenly you had a portal into this mysterious kingdom called China. And there was this terminal, and there was always somebody speaking very bad English, but you had access to a vast manufacturing base. Alibaba is trying to set up a Vietnamese version of that in the country, but it's very difficult. If you send an email to a producer of gloves or PPE, 9 out of 10, you won't get an answer. So I think the culture here is, again, very much contact and relationship built. So you have to really have an agent as a separate layer. So it's still very atomized. It's very small. So the industrial scape, so to speak, the scope, or that China has realized through portals like Alibaba, is not here yet, and I think there is much to gain. And in terms of sectors, particularly the Netherlands, where Hedda is from, I think agriculture is a fantastic chance here, from the geography, but also from the eagerness of the people. So that is already discovered by the Netherlands. And I think for the others are already being leveraged. So you mentioned already, Gabor, textile, shoes, furniture is very big. Big money is being made in furniture. So the more traditional manufacturing stuff is moving here. And I would love to see move China, Vietnam up the value chain in tech. So there is not too much R&D happening. So assembling a phone for Apple is not R&D. So I think the country deserves, because they have good universities. Actually, this is also something very different from China. A lot of foreign investment in the universities. So the British guys, they have a university in Hanoi. There is an American one, Fulbright, here in Ho Chi Minh. The Australians have RMIT. So there's a lot of money coming in, also through the World Bank and other funds. So it's about time that Vietnam starts to advertise themselves. And this is a question to the group. I'm not aware of a trade agency of Vietnam in the European Union. I'm not aware of a trade agency in China. So there is work to be done. So I think we as Europeans can help Southeast Asia here as well. But again, it's inward looking, and I think there's really a big gap here. Yeah, unfortunately.
There are a couple of agencies who look at Vietnam as an alternative, but I would say they are not biased, if you see what I mean. So they are not pushing very hard Vietnam as the alternative to China. It's more like many of them, whether they are think tanks or business consulting agencies or trade consultancies, of course their primary focus is to create turnover. So now they know that China+1 is a thing, and then they are advertising Vietnam or even India, for example. India it seems to be a big hopeful, not so much now because everybody is looking at how COVID-19 will play out, but just before the pandemic, India was equally presented as a China+1 destination. And then they usually don't say instead of China, but it's more like the backup for China or the complementary elements of supply chain for China. But there is one very important thing that I would like to mention to Hedda, is that no other destination, perhaps in the future India, but currently I don't know of any other destination that can create the volume of China. So this is something that is basically irreplaceable, because it doesn't matter if it's agricultural products or manufacturing or something that it is an app that needs a high volume of user data, or market for milk, or I don't know what. China is just an indispensable element of any company that wants to scale up now. Ironically, the United States is another market, because there are so many industries where US is half the consumption in the world. So Americans eat half of a lot of food stuff and buy half of the cars and take half of the medicine in the world. But if you look at non-mature markets, where the dynamism is, where the growth is that simply if China disappears or is scaled down as a market, as a source of labor, as a source of, let's say, assembly technology or manufacturing or anything like this, then the company literally has to patch that volume together from different markets. There is absolutely no other country that can just simply step in and replace China.
I totally agree. I think you're hitting the nail on the head. That is for high tech, but even for agricultural products. So I think you're absolutely right. China is here to stay. I don't believe that China will substantially reduce its turnover. It has grown like crazy over the last months, and it has also external reasons. So I think it's mostly political motivation, and the tax issue, the Trump tax, obviously made many companies make the opportunistic choice, like my clients, so to speak, to move to Vietnam. And then you have to really open the Excel sheet and make the calculation. Is it really cheaper to move to Indonesia? Is it faster to set up shop here in Vietnam? How do you handle, a certain level of corruption? So if you make that bottom line, then you are already very far behind the comma in terms of the gains versus China. Not to mention all the chores you have if you want to leave China to stop your company. Everybody wants your money. So I think instead of talking about China+1 in terms of leaving China, it's a rebalancing act, and I think that is I think the conversation should be per industry, and it could actually be a win-win. But again, yes, the politics is so much on the forefront, not only with the US but even within Asia, that it's clouding the debate.
Yeah, that's right. I perfectly agree. Another kind of question from Davide Urbani. Are there still opportunities for those who are not so good at technical stuff, but are good at making Guangxi job, people relations for those of you who don't speak Chinese, and making people cooperate with each other? I mean, in places like China, Indonesia, Vietnam. If you don't mind me going ahead with this first, I actually see in both China and Southeast Asia the need for those kind of people growing in recent years. So if you look at China, 10 years ago, the typical expat in China was the kind of middle-class middle manager who was coordinating, training, and managing technical stuff. In quality control, in manufacturing, in R&D, in marketing, perhaps less and less in sales. But what you can see now is those jobs in China itself have been taken over by automation, machines, very talented local staff, and very talented local partners. I mean, outsourced to local companies who already have the technology and the know-how and so on. So actually in China, you don't need the tens of thousands of technical middle managers who know how to put an airplane engine together or who know how to run an assembly business. There is, Chinese people can look after that now. And then the question is, so what kind of expats do you need in China? And the irony on this whole issue is that the more an international company localizes their workforce in a country like China, the less the headquarters know about China, because they don't have those thousands of people who are flying back and forth and bring back the news in their native language, whether it's English or Italian or Dutch. So now they really need the lobbyists. One typical extremely successful expat that I meet more and more often at chambers of commerce and my events and so on is somebody who works for a company like BASF or Scania or Apple and has a sinology degree. So they have very little to do with the technical stuff. They speak the language fluently, which is increasingly a requirement. And then, of course, they can learn as much as they need for the job about the technical stuff. And one manager that I know very well, he has been with Scania for, I think, for 6 or 7 years now. Of course, eventually you pick up the technical knowledge, and you have to present it and negotiate it anyway. You don't have to build the damn stuff. And I can perfectly imagine that in Southeast Asian countries, that is a trajectory as well, for both the reasons that now suddenly Western headquarters have to deal with those countries that they didn't have to before. So suddenly, because of China+1 and because of all these new supply chains, these countries pop up on their map by the half dozen. So, okay, wait, Thailand and Vietnam, what's the difference? And also, because these countries don't go through the same trajectory. They already have automation. They already have digitalization. They only need the brain.
Yes, I would like to challenge you on one point. I think there is a substantial difference between China and the Southeast Asian countries on one point. The lobbyist type who speaks Mandarin fluently is extremely valuable in China, but also back at headquarters. I think it's, ironically enough, it's more difficult on the long term to be an expat in Southeast Asia for the following reason. Because these countries are already opener to the West. They have more people who have studied in the West, pro rata, and they have a lot of foreign influence already. So the closeness and the uniqueness of China, in particular the language barrier, is much bigger in China than, say, in Vietnam or in Thailand, because the exposure is bigger. So to be very honest, if I would be very self-critical, of course you need, here we are in the stage of the technical guy who's setting up this, seed firm or brewery, or is helping technology transfer. So this is very much the model that we had in the 80s and 90s, and it's still valuable. Technology transfer will go on, but this lobbyist kind of thing in a country in Southeast Asia is so deep entrenched in the person-to-person relationships between people of the same kind. I do not think, even if I would become very fluent in Vietnamese or Thai, I can reach the same level of penetration as in China, oddly enough, because it's really, a little bit more the opium den still here. You really have this, you still will need the agent for a long time instead of inserting yourself. So in that sense, I think China is actually opener, because everything is done in Mandarin in a very natural way. And once you're in, you actually get a lot of respect. I think here it's still, the oddity that you speak the local language. It's seen a little bit as a threat maybe, but maybe I'm wrong. But it's fundamentally different. Yeah.
Makes sense. Using the time that we have, and I can see that there are no immediate questions right now, but there might be. So I would like to share a couple of articles with everybody here in the chat box. So one of them is by PwC. I really liked it. It is regarding China+1. The reason why I liked it is that it is just a quick summary about how China+1 is going to work after the COVID-19 pandemic. And then another article I would like to share with you. It's a little bit of a harder read, but I think it could be interesting. Is the article I mentioned about how Chinese companies have their own China+1 strategies is quite interesting, and it has some relevance with what we said, for example, about how companies like Tencent and Alibaba are reaching out to Southeast Asia. I think these were the best articles that I could find.
On the latter one, I'm not sure how many Vietnamese people are online, but I'm surprised to find out that many Vietnamese are not aware that Zalo, Yalo, some people say here in the South, but also Lazada, all these platforms that are being built up here, and most of them are Chinese injected. So they are 40-60% Chinese. Of course, we also have Gojek, which is Indonesian, and Singapore.
Right.
So there's a lot of investment. So you're absolutely right. On the e-commerce side, I think China is very big in the region, and they have they learn from the locals how to give it a local flavor. So they're also learning to localize. And I'm actually proud of the Chinese, because the Chinese have such a strong dominant culture. So they're also selecting their managers, to work here, who are more agile in that sense. I can give you some examples later. Like a young lady I met here who's working for Hikvision, which is the famous in America blacklisted company that's making all these surveillance cameras. But I've never seen such an agile, fluently Vietnamese speaking girl who was in her early 20s managing a huge team here in Southeast Asia. So that is remarkable. So China is not only the monolith with the state-owned companies, but there is also a very agile group.
I'm actually happy that you challenged me on that one question, because it took us to a place where I was hoping we would end up, and that is the leadership aspect. We were talking about this a lot, but I would like to reiterate one important point, is that if you are a company that is building a China+1 strategy, you must be aware that the person who has successfully managed the China operations and has experience there is not the same person who might be the best fit to continue the operations in a place like Vietnam or Indonesia or Bangladesh. Because if you look at it in terms of the characteristics that you need, the level of risk-taking, the level of empathy, the level of novelty seeking, the level of compliance, the level of inconvenience with certain situations and flexibility to overcome those situations, the requirements of China, and especially China now, which is increasingly about compliance and predictability and safety. I mean, one of the things that I hear from expats who love living in China now is they love it because it's so safe. So places actually select people with a certain life philosophy, and deselect people who are whose life philosophy doesn't fit so well. And increasingly, people who choose China as their second home or even their primary home are the people who want a predictable, safe, well-ordered environment for themselves. Now, imagine that let's say you have been in China for a couple of years, and then you're really happy with where China is going around you, and then suddenly the company requires you to hop over all those hurdles that the trade wars and the visa regulations and COVID-19 put between countries, and then readapt and restart in a place like Vietnam or like Indonesia or like Bangladesh, which has all of these differences, like Jurriaan, for example, now mentioned. You can experience it as a time travel. If you are not cut out of the fabric, then you can just experience it as a huge mess. But if you are the kind of person who, let's say, was hoping for the mysterious Orient and you really cannot find it in Shenzhen, then maybe Southeast Asia is exactly what you need to keep your balance, or half a year there and half a year in China.
Fantastic remark. I think you are leading, and I think you are right. You are now announcing the death of the management rotation model. I think it's silly to ask people to do 6 months or a year in China and then, Singapore and then somewhere else. I think that's not going to work. It's not going to work because of the barriers that we have because of COVID, which I'm afraid will linger around for a couple of years. But also for these reasons, you need time to adjust. You need time to like the place.
Not the same profile.
Yes, but I think, Gabor, you know this better than me. I think many companies are still stubborn. They're shifting you around the world like it was the old model. So I hope that's actually going to change. And if somebody is really happy in Shanghai, well, then let that person be successful in Shanghai. Why not?
Perfectly right. Perfectly right. I think it comes from, some of the challenge comes from that the understanding of human resources, that you can shift them around, just like, let's say, you can take a machine from Germany, then it served its purpose in China, and then in a couple of years you can move it on to Indonesia, but human resources don't work that way.
No, we luckily all develop. So Gabor, would you be so kind, maybe pull up that last slide that I gave you, because I really would like to show our guests my very humble analysis of how people tick. And I would love to have feedback on this one, because I think there is very distinct and very funny differences between the workforces in China and in Southeast Asia.
It should come up in a couple of seconds.
There we are. So if I'm allowed to start with China, so as I mentioned earlier in this webinar, I think there is a generational difference. Of course, China, by the way, has also millennials and Gen Z people who hate the 996. So that wave is coming a little bit later. But here in Southeast Asia, it's mostly Gen Z, and that makes a very distinct difference. But China is also different in another sense. I think you have to understand that China now has seen two waves, I think, Gabor, of immigration from the countryside into the city. So in a city like Shanghai, Beijing, or Shenzhen, I think most people, they were not born in the countryside anymore. So that percentage is going down. While in Southeast Asia, most people, they're just from the rice paddies, and they're directly coming from very rural or small town backgrounds, which is a good thing. I remember when I lived in Beijing, they always said, don't hire people from Beijing because they're already entitled. You want to hire those people who are coming directly from the countryside because they're better motivated. And there is some truth in that. But I think also there is a difference in the cultural values. As everybody knows, China is really on a more nationalistic path. So when I talk to people of all ages in China, I think the national pride is a very dominant topic. I think maybe, Gabor, you can shed some light on that. So there is a very Chinese value-oriented thing going on in China from different angles. So I feel people, they're very much focused, for better or worse, on economic development. To keep up with the Joneses in China is really tough, because everything is very expensive and very competitive. And from the personal taste, I think Chinese people, for several reasons, language barriers, internet blockages, they're very much, savoring the more East Asian tastes. While here, I'm really, as I mentioned, they are omnivores, consuming Korean TV, Chinese, dianshiju, and also Western stuff. And it really requires a totally different management style. People are talking like some kids coming off American college about uniqueness and purpose and experimentation. So I'm finding myself in some, West Coast, lounge cafe. So it's very different. And it's really, I would like to challenge you first, Gabor, if this makes sense to you, and obviously also to the other people online.
Yes, it makes perfect sense to me, and not only because there is this recurring topic in our call about Southeast Asia in a way replicating the Chinese development model, but also doing it in its own way. And I think the key here is the penetration of the foreign, so to speak. If you look at China, and if you understand that most of the big cities where business takes place in China are in that eastern crescent, one of the things that is hard to imagine if you've never lived there is how far the foreign is, the abroad is. Anywhere else in the world, Southeast Asia included, is you look this way, you look that way, and you see foreign things. And sometimes also the foreign comes to your own country, which is certainly true in Vietnam all through history. But if you're here in Shanghai, then one way there is the sea, and the other way is thousands and thousands of miles of China, and then below that there is a desert or a mountain range or something like this. So you're not really exposed. And what you described is really the kind of exposure that, first of all, we don't have in China. And then if you're an expat and you live here for 5 years, you even forget how much it's part of everyday life in a place like Vietnam. And I think, in a way, what you explained there is it kind of branches out of this difference, because I can even imagine that a young Vietnamese goes back to China from the same a young Vietnamese goes back to Vietnam from the same university with a completely different mindset from somebody who is a young Chinese person who has got a degree from the same university.
Absolutely.
And then something has come to me, and I might as well ask you live, because most of the time when we do these calls, then I go through the recording afterwards, and I edit these kind of 5 to 10 minute snippets that I put online. But I have the feeling that this is another call that I would like to put online in its entirety. Are you okay with that?
I'm absolutely okay with it, and I hope that everybody found it useful, because I think we had a little bit of a different conversation. It was not the typical webinar, going down the pitch for China or the pitch for Southeast Asia. I think we both like to debunk stuff and to go a little bit deeper. So I hope it was useful for everybody and entertaining as well.
Personally, knowing my audience a little bit, I think it was. And it delivered exactly the kind of thing that you cannot read lots of articles. So obviously the statistics of what percentage of companies are leaving China and what they are moving out. You can do that with a Google search. But what I wanted to bring here is the human perspective and also the first-hand stories. So that's why we are here. And I think we have been helpful, or at least entertaining, or maybe both.
Exactly. So thank you, Gabor, for hosting.
We will certainly stay in touch. I wish you a very nice late afternoon, and I will reach out to you. I will drop you a line when I have put this recording online. I usually put it on YouTube, and I send out a couple of links. And yes, of course, let's stay in touch. How do you say? My heart tells me I wish I could say see you soon in Vietnam, but times being as they are, we cannot be sure.
Well, or in China, we never know.
That's right. That's right.
Okay. Well, thank you to you, and thank you to everybody for your time. Appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye for now.
Bye-bye.